All right, welcome everyone. We're so glad that you're here. Again, this is On the Radar, the SAVE Act and other policies impacting nonprofits. My name is Gwen Stembridge, and I am the Associate Director of Education and Partnerships here at Nonprofit Vote. I am going to share my screen so you have some slides here in front of you to follow along with. All right, so I like to start out with some announcements and just some basic housekeeping things here. There will be a question and answer session at the end, so please do prepare your questions and answers. If you'll please put them in the Q&A section on your Zoom bar at either the bottom or the top of your screen. There should be a button that says Q&A. You can keep the chat in the chat, but putting questions in the Q&A will just help us stay organized so that we can really respond to those in an organized fashion at the end. Please put them there right in the Q&A section. Also, just a reminder, the slides and then also the recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone who registered, whether they attended or not. And then closed captioning is always available via Zoom. And if you have other needs for future webinars, please do let us know ahead of time. Great. So this is On the Radar, the SAVE Act. We're here to talk about the impacts of this bill and similar ones like it, not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. This is what our time over the next hour or so will look like. We're welcoming you right now, so glad that you're here. Please do feel free to share in the chat your name, an organization that you're with, if you're with an organization, and then where you're joining from. We've got folks from all over the country, so we love seeing our partners from across different parts of the country. So glad that you all are here. I'll give a few highlights from Nonprofit Vote, and then we'll do some introductions of our panelists today, and then have a panelist conversation. We've got some experts in the field who have been tracking these bills for quite a while and the impact of them on nonprofits. So I'm excited to share their wisdom with you all and their experience with you all today. Then we'll have some time for the audience Q&A. We always have a call to action, so we'll share that as well, and then we'll close out. So who is Nonprofit Vote? We've been around since about 2006 and really are here to support you all as nonprofit leaders in doing voter engagement, and specifically nonpartisan voter engagement. Nonprofits have a really unique opportunity and skill set and trust built within communities to do nonpartisan voter engagement. And we actually have found through several reports over the years that nonprofits are uniquely situated to do that. We know that individuals who are contacted by nonprofits about voting are 10 percentage points more likely to actually show up and vote than others. So you have a unique role in this work, and we are here really to support you all as nonprofits within that vision of eventually and continuing to build a more inclusive democracy. A reminder as well to go along with that, that we are staying nonpartisan within this. That is part of our role as an organization. It is part of our call as a 501c3 nonprofit. We are here to stay nonpartisan and give you nonpartisan information so that you can do the same for your communities. So I want to start out here. I'm going to pass it to Brian in a minute here, but we have the privilege of having our executive director, Brian Miller, with us here to moderate the panel. He has been doing this work for years and years, and we have particularly leaned into some of the research and advocacy around this bill in particular because of the intersection of nonprofits and the work that we do and voting and our democracy. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you. And as Gwen says, said, the work of Nonprofit Vote, our core focus is really supporting nonprofits in the voter engagement work that you're doing, bringing the communities that you serve to the table. As this webinar is really about the policy side of it, and we're not oblivious to the fact that this policy certainly also impacts our ability to engage the communities we serve. And, and as an organization, we do believe that a strong, healthy, and civically engaged nonprofit sector is really essential to fostering a healthy democracy. And as such, we support policies that strengthen the civic voice of nonprofits, the general health of nonprofits, and the communities served by nonprofits. And by extension, we're concerned and opposed to policies that would limit that voice. And that's sort of the context for today's webinar about the SAVE Act and the many variations that we see at the state level and other similar policies. And so, as Gwen says, we have a wonderful line of panelists that you see here. Andrew Garber, who is counsel for the democracy programs at the Brennan Center. Daniel Griffith, who is Senior Director of Policy with the Voting Rights Lab, and Elena Langworthy with State Voices. She's the Policy Director there. And we're going to start this off with Andrew and ask Andrew with the Brennan Center to tell us a little bit about the Brennan Center and their take on the SAVE Act. Andrew.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you and Gwen for organizing and letting me participate in such an important panel today. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. So as Brian said, I am an attorney with the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center. For those who aren't familiar, the Brennan Center is a nationally focused think tank and legal services provider. We have a few core issues that we work on, including a number of folks who work in the election space in one way or another. I work on our voting rights team, so my work focuses primarily on doing everything we can to make sure that people have free, fair, equal, convenient access to the ballot box. We try to work to remove barriers people may face and to develop and see implemented new ideas that could help make sure that people are able to vote again freely, equally, conveniently in the future. This work takes a variety of different forms. We litigate voting rights cases. Often we will be party counsel opposing a law that we think places unfair, unconstitutional burdens on voters, or we also have an amicus practice in which we frequently aren't representing a party in the case, but we write a brief before a court, can be the U.S. Supreme Court, a state Supreme Court, a federal appeals court, in which we explain a position in the case that we don't think is fully represented. Our work also involves quite a bit of legislative advocacy at the federal and state levels. Again, we work nationwide when we see opportunities within states to enact or implement a policy that we think is really important to voters. We will also do quite a bit of work when necessary to oppose potential laws that have that would harm voters if enacted. And looking at it at the federal level, we've worked hard over the years to help develop and hopefully one day pass the Freedom to Vote and John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Acts, which would be extraordinary steps forward for voting rights in this country. And now, as of course we're talking about today, have quite a bit of focus on the SAVE Act, which is something that would do the opposite and be perhaps the most harmful voting-related bill that has ever been passed at the federal level, if that were to happen. Our work as well involves quite a bit of policy research development. We have a team of researchers who are PhDs or masters who really know how to get in there, run the numbers, analyze policies, analyze impacts. We work very closely hand in hand with them on everything we do. And so we try to take a really data-based, evidence-based approach to all the work we do as well. So transitioning in a little to talk about the SAVE Act, we'll get into detail about all its potential ramifications over the next hour, but just a very high-level overview. The Safeguarding American Voters Eligibility Act would require documentary proof of citizenship for every single person in the country every time they go to register to vote or re-register to vote. And that second piece is an important one that I think sometimes people miss. It's not just that the first time you register, you have to have one of these documents. If you've been a registered voter at your house for 50 years and you move down the street, well, you need to come up with your birth certificate or passport, or else you're not going to be able to register at your new address. This would have numerous harms that, again, I'll hold off just for the moment because we're going to talk about them, but I want to make sure not to bury that lead, that there will be significant ramifications for voters, for particular groups of voters, as well as for election officials. One of the most jarring provisions in the bill is that any election official who registers someone to vote who didn't provide sufficient proof of their citizenship, that election official is now subject to criminal penalties for that. That is extraordinarily chilling. And then the last thing I'll note just here at the top is the SAVE Act would also require states to undertake really flawed voter purges. That we've seen purges like this happen in states many times over the years, and over we know they're overbroad, that they sweep in eligible citizens. The SAVE Act does not have safeguards to protect against that. And so we'll pause there and turn it back to Brian, but looking forward to being able to speak to you all more about this.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate that information from Brennan Center. And again, we're going to dig into a lot of these questions in more detail after the first round of panelist introductions. And so next up, we were going to bring up on screen is Daniel Griffith with the Voting Rights Lab. And Daniel, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to participate in this conversation, and I'm happy to see, looking at the list of attendees, a lot of familiar names, including some folks with whom I'm probably continuing this conversation from this morning, as a matter of fact, with respect to some of these issues. So I'm Daniel Griffith. I'm the Senior Director of Policy with Voting Rights Lab. Voting Rights Lab is an organization. We track election-related legislation in all 50 states. We have been doing so since 2019, and we have sort of our crown jewel, which is the Voting Rights Lab Legislative Tracker, which is a historical compendium of all of the election-related legislation that we have tracked since 2021. For each bill, we have an attorney look at the legislation and summarize its impact on voters, election officials, and present that in hopefully a plain language, sort of accessible summary. We also have a process whereby we have sortable tags that users of the tracker, which is a free resource, can use to sort through various iterations of the bill to determine various iterations of legislation. If you want, for example, to look at every early voting bill that may have been filed in Iowa in 2021, that's something you can easily do. If you want to find every bill across the country that would impact the availability of a drop box or where to register, that's something that can easily be done as well. So if you're not familiar with the work that the tracker does, certainly would invite you to click the link in the chat and go ahead and sign up and play in our sandbox a little bit. Also, in addition to the tracker, we do a number of recurring policy products, including the markup, which is a weekly update concerning where bills are currently in the state legislative process to make sure that our readers understand the progress that a lot of these bills make through the legislative session, as well as the Lever, which is a monthly product that we use to uplift various aspects of state legislative advancement, work in the democracy movement generally, and also we include what we call a hot policy take, which is where we try to lift up and kind of take a dive into one particular area of state legislative policy. One of the hottest policies right now in the state legislative landscape, unfortunately, is having to do with the slide that you see right here. This is a slide as of Monday of places where bills relating to documentary proof of citizenship at the registration, during the registration process. So basically, you know, taking sort of what the SAVE Act would do at the federal level and distilling it down to an individual state level bill. The map in front of you shows where in 2025 those bills have been introduced. And it's certainly something that we've seen, you know, thinking historically has been in a few states every year, but has really kind of come up in popularity with respect to what we're seeing in 2025, perhaps inspired by, perhaps in concert with the SAVE Act in Congress. And we'll get into it a bit more detail, but one thing that you'll notice about the bills as we talk about them is that there's this notion that the state legislatures are always sort of a laboratory, and state legislators are taking that very seriously with respect to these bills, because this legislation that you see laid out, there's many different varieties that states are doing, from only requiring certain people to provide documentary proof, to modeling themselves after the current Arizona system, to basically copying the SAVE Act word for word. There's a lot of different particular tactics that states are looking at in, trying to create that SAVE Act sort of impact on their voters individually as we move forward in the legislative process. So I'm excited to kind of dive more into these, but we'll save that for the next section.
Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate that information from the Voting Rights Lab. And next up, we have Elena Langworthy with State Voices. And Elena, look forward to hearing from you and about the work that State Voices is doing and some of your observations related to these policies.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Nonprofit Vote, for extending the offer for State Voices to be part of this panel discussion. You'll see some highlights up on the screen. A little bit about State Voices. We are a network of 24 state tables. We have 8 emerging states and over 1,200 on-the-ground partners in all 50 states. We really serve as some of the connective tissue that brings organizations together, aligns our strategies, and amplifies impact. And I think our collective impact can really be seen through the 2024 work up here on this screen. So last year, we completed 179 million voter contacts. We answered 60,000 voter questions through the Election Protection Program that we co-lead. And we worked with our states to advance worker rights in 8 states through ballot measures. So we are really all in on advancing voting rights, protecting democracy, and supporting people in states. And for all of those reasons, right, we are really concerned about the SAVE Act and the similar bills that are moving through states as we speak. And we'll talk a little bit about the impacts that they have on our network and what this really looks like for how we do the work moving forward. But I also want to point out that this is really a piece of legislation and an effort that is building on a ton of different restrictive voting bills that have passed in years prior. And so we don't have the exact blueprint of how we will deal with, the implications of the SAVE Act, but we know that we have dealt with restrictive bills and have adapted our program strategy to meet the moment, and we expect to do the same for the SAVE Act. And I think that is where I will turn it back to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and really appreciate the work that State Voices is doing. And didn't mention this, but earlier we do run a field program in a few states, and a number of our state affiliates are tied in with the state tables in their respective states, and so work with State Voices on those fronts. And so jumping back into this work, and I'm going to put this first question to Andrew, and thank you, all 3 of you could stay on the camera now, that'd be great. Andrew, I'm going to throw this first question to you first, and I'm going to pass it on to the others. And really getting at what are the potential impacts of the SAVE Act on the voters themselves? Which voters are impacted and how are they impacted? So this is really looking at the voters, and if you could tell us a little bit about what you see in the SAVE Act.
Absolutely, happy to. At the highest level, every American who's eligible to vote, who wants to register and cast their ballot, will be impacted by this through, if nothing else, inconvenience, and in some cases, pretty significant inconvenience, but it goes a lot deeper than that for a lot of people. Research the Brennan Center did with some colleagues at the University of Maryland and boat riders found that over 21 million Americans, eligible citizens who are over the age of 18, lack easy access to the necessary documents to be able to satisfy voter registration under the SAVE Act. These are documents that they may not know where they are. They may be in an inaccessible location. For a lot of people, it might be that their birth certificate is at their parents' house and their parents live hours and hours away. These are the sorts of things that can prevent people from being able to register. And of those 21 million, it's worth noting several million simply don't have one of these documents at all. And again, for the vast majority of people, this is going to mean either their birth certificate or their passport. Those are going to be the only things they could reasonably use to satisfy registration under the SAVE Act. Additionally, the research shows that around 12 million people who voted in the 2020 election would be among those 21 million people who are impacted. So in a lot of cases, again, millions and millions of cases, these are active voters, people who are registering and turning out and want to participate. This isn't some hypothetical or referring to a group or to groups of people who aren't turning out anyway. So we see off the bat that upwards of almost 10% of eligible voters in our country could be affected. There are some specific groups of voters that I think it's very important to talk about. That research showed that Black Americans as well as Native Americans are particularly likely to lack access to these documents that they would need. They would therefore overall face more disenfranchising effects than would other voters. Married women, this is a really important category. A lot of married women have changed their names. Therefore, the name they use to register to vote might not match what's on their birth certificate or passport. The SAVE Act doesn't account for this. It shrugs its shoulders. It's silent, but these women could have a lot of trouble registering and voting when they're not able to produce documents with matching names that satisfy what the bills required. And is so often the case with voting restrictions. It is also people with disabilities, and it's younger voters and less wealthy Americans who are going to struggle to be able to satisfy this bill's requirements. It can be hard for them to spend a lot of time at the DMV, to travel further distances, to wait in line, or in some cases to be able to go get these documents. Those are extra challenges in place for Americans who are in those groups. And then the last thing I say before I give it back is there will be a lot of ramifications for election officials as well. This is something I imagine we'll talk about a bit today, but there are a lot of provisions in the bill making it harder for election officials to do their jobs that are going to practically result in election officials kind of narrowing the availability they give for voter registration to people within their jurisdiction. And it's very important that we discuss the harms to the officials themselves, but in terms of voters, that trickles down to the voters, right? If election officials are pulling back the availability to you, that's something you're going to feel. You might have been able to use an online voter registration system before, for example. After the SAVE Act, that's something that may not be available or may be much more narrowly available.
Thank you, Andrew. And Elena, I'll turn to you next, and then Daniel. Anything to add as far as you see the impact on actual voters of the SAVE Act?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Andrew hit on great points, just to call out again, because I think it is so so important to name that, like, a lot of women will be deeply impacted by this bill. If you change your name, which is still a very common practice, should you get married, you have to change your all of the documents and all of the like proof of citizenship materials would need to change, and that is both costly and time consuming, and just puts an extra burden on a voter that doesn't need to be there. In addition, yes, the impact on local election officials is a big one. We think that would just create less time for voter services and less time to really develop those community partnerships that we see as real assets in a number of states. A number of our affiliates will work with local election offices to set up voter registration drives, to keep them informed, and to work in tandem with them to solve voter challenges, voter concerns in the communities. And I think that it is really important that that time isn't restricted by having to check the proof of citizenship for voters, for new voters. Additionally, we have programs in a whole number of states that really now face uncertainty around how they can do voter registration through their voter engagement programs throughout the year. And so just a really big burden.
And Daniel, I was going to go to you for next, but actually I might go ahead and if you want to tie up anything on the impact on voters, but then we're going to shift over to the impact on nonprofits and the organizations doing the registration drives.
Yeah, so kind of thinking about the impact of the SAVE Act from the state legislative perspective, it's assuming Congress, or if Congress were to pass the bills, you're then at that point going to have 50 state laws implementing the SAVE Act at the local level. And what that runs into is inevitably you've got variations in terms of how states determine to implement the act, as well as the need to interact with their existing state code in terms of how things are done, which is bound to cause confusion in terms of election officials, the voters themselves, and understanding exactly what their new responsibilities may be. Thinking about just in terms of local election officials, do they now have to find themselves in a place where they're gauging the authenticity of various documents, or what combination of documents, assuming, thinking of the issue around a birth certificate not matching an original name, how is that cured? Is that curable? That sort of thing. Just thinking about all those sorts of things, like a lot of the questions that are in the chat right now. I mean, like anything else, the devil's in the details. And the congressional bill can say what it says, but when the rubber hits the road, there's so much to kind of worry about as far as that goes.
Thank you. Did you want to take a crack at the impact on the nonprofits doing the voter registration, or I pass it over to Andrew?
I can take a crack, and I'm sure others will have things at it as well. I think, I think it's pretty clear that when you're talking about groups that are engaged in voter registration drives, one, to the extent they have to interact with voters and actually accept or somehow transmit this information regarding the documentary proof to election officials as part of the voter registration process, that's going to be obviously a new challenge for folks who are doing things on largely a volunteer basis. Training folks up with respect to those requirements is definitely going to be challenging. Also, those states that choose to enforce the requirements of the SAVE Act with criminal laws about, if you don't gather this, then we're going to prosecute you. Obviously, that's something that not a lot of folks are going to want to interact with, and it's going to have a deterrent effect in terms of the volunteer work as well. So, certainly I think those two pieces are going to be pretty deeply impactful in terms of what, groups that are engaged in voter registration might see.
Okay. And noting, Daniel, you appreciate the point that you lifted up. The fact is because the state variations of the SAVE Act all have different ways they're being implemented. Some may allow for different ways, but I know the SAVE Act at the national level has a much more clear barrier, at least as I understand it, that impacts third-party voter registration drives. And Andrew, you want to speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So one of the things the SAVE Act would do if it becomes law is to have serious impacts on the way people are able to access different types of voter registration. So I'm hoping everyone here is registered to vote. And if you are, you might have done it by one of a few different ways. You might have gone in person to an elections office. That's great. That should be available to you as an option. But you might have done it by mail. You might have received and sent back a form that got you registered to vote. You might have gone and done it online. Some of you may become registered through automatic voter registration, which is a process that exists in many states, where you go to the DMV or interact with a different government agency. If you give them all the relevant info you would need to vote, which you're already doing if you're getting a driver's license, for example, you're registered to vote, no additional steps necessary. As well as voter registration drives, of course, which I know is a big one we want to talk about today. Well, the SAVE Act would interact with these existing types of registration in a few different ways. The first is when it comes to mail voting. The SAVE Act explicitly says if you register to vote by mail, you send in that registration. You're not registered until you go in person and provide the documentary proof of citizenship to an election official. So it is functionally getting rid of registration by mail. It doesn't say whether or not something like a voter registration drive can continue, but if we read between the lines, it seems like it would seriously undermine the ability of those registration drives to work effectively. First of all, it says that election officials are the ones who have to receive the documentary proof of citizenship. people working voter registration drives generally aren't election officials. What does this mean? Can people, the drives, take a photocopy of the document and bring it to election officials as part of their work? That's unclear whether or not a photocopy suffices with something like online voter registration. Can officials create some online secure portal where you upload a copy or a photo of the document? That, again, is unclear. And it's why I took a moment at the top to talk about the criminal penalties election officials face if they register people who haven't provided satisfactory proof of citizenship under the law's parameters. It's going to make it very, very discouraging for election officials to work hard to make sure they can continue to have effective registration drives in their county, or to make sure that their town or city offers online voter registration when they face potential criminal penalties if someone else happens to interpret those words in the bill differently. So it's something that's really not thought through, and it puts a very large burden to continue different types of voter registration, such again as registration drives on local election officials, on the people actually doing the work. These are systems that work extraordinarily well that aren't registering people who aren't citizens to vote. And by tightening it so much, it's going to have a much larger ramifications for voters than it is providing any type of election security.
Thank you, Andrew. And that is consistent with what I've heard from some of the folks who've looked at this, is that at the most extreme interpretation of the law, basically a third party group, it says you have to present it essentially to the election officials, which means there's no more role for a third party voter registration. Online is highly subject to debate whether that would even be allowed. Some of the state laws may be a little bit more explicit about that. And obviously this has a lot of impact on election officials as well. I've heard people use the unfunded mandate as an impact on election officials because they now have all these additional costs that are not being paid for. Any comment on that before we jump to the next question?
I'll just say at a high level, funding for election officials nationwide is extraordinarily important. Running elections securely and efficiently takes a lot of resources. There are so many things a lot of us don't think about day to day, like making sure you have enough pens and a backup generator in case the power goes out somewhere. And every moment an election official now has to think about, how am I going to implement the SAVE Act or state equivalent? What am I going to do about online voter registration? How am I going to make sure that I can divert resources to continue efforts to make sure people can register in my county, is taking away from their ability to conduct those other essential activities. And when they don't have the funds to do it, and so many of them are already strapped for funds, it means maybe instead of updating your voting machines, you're printing out new materials to share with people so they understand they have to have these documents to be able to vote. So the unfunded aspect of this and the need for more election official funding generally is a very important point. And I thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Andrew. And so I think the next question is really about what is your organization doing? I'm going to turn this over to Elena. Start with Elena, at least. What is your organization doing to respond to the SAVE Act as it moves through Congress? And I understand it's scheduled for a House vote. Well, not scheduled, but it could come up to a House vote at any time. It's been fast tracked. But Elena, maybe you could speak a little bit to that and what State Voices is doing around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I saw it perhaps in a question. The general sense right now is that maybe by the end of March is when it would be heard, but that could also be extended. My organization, State Voices, we are, I will say with all humility here, really kind of getting started in the federal advocacy space. We know that we have a lot of wonderful organizing and advocacy strength at the state and local level. And so now we are trying to think about how we can use that in the federal space. And so it is an experiment for us. And what we are doing right now, we have signed on to several of the coalition letters. Our states are meeting with members of Congress to voice concern, to really talk to how this will, look in a state and the challenges with implementation. We are promoting it on social media, doing op-eds, all of the communication strategies you can think about. We are also doing some training on voter registration best practices. We work with One Arizona on some of our voter registration projects, and so have been in touch with them on, lessons that we can learn, given that they have a documentary proof of citizenship already on the books. And I think, again, whoever said it, the devil is in the detail, and to figure out how that will look in each state, is a little concerning. And then we're also, seeing these bills being mirrored at the state level. And so a number of our states have what we call, the copycat bills. I think it's Alabama, Michigan, Missouri, Montana, New York, Pennsylvania, Washington, I think, have very similar bills. And so again, just working with our state affiliates to understand the impact of the bill, to help with testimony research, and all of our states are paying attention there as well. I would say that this, we are still a voter engagement organization, and so that has not changed. We are still doing canvassing, we're still doing phone calls to voters, and we are still, rooted in that. And so it is really balancing both priorities.
Thank you, Elena. And Daniel, I'm going to jump to the next question here with you, which is right on, which is really, what are the other policies that your organization is tracking? This really goes to the state level. And I know you had that map with all the states and the variations. Are there any that rise to the top, any particular states that have the most egregious examples of the STATE Act, SAVE Act, or similar legislation that you're watching that people on this call should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, so looking at the bills that are pending at the state level, there are really a lot of different versions of that notion of documentary proof of citizenship with registration, which is what the SAVE Act really covers. And there are certainly, I think Elena already mentioned some states that we're really looking at in terms of those pretty much straight copycat bills with respect to the SAVE Act. Missouri is one that stands out. Its version of the bill is currently pending on the Senate floor, may move before the end of the session. There are several other bills like that as well. But, even the ones that aren't copycats necessarily are concerning in their own respect. Just thinking about things that might get action this week. Wyoming's version of the bill is going to become law by Friday unless the governor takes action. West Virginia had a hearing on a bill this morning that would actually impose a bit of a documentary proof requirement during the voting process rather than during the registration process. So, kind of watching where that goes in terms of the voter ID aspect. Huge hearing in Texas tomorrow with their bill, which is a priority for their lieutenant governor, SB 16, where they're basically trying to implement an Arizona-style system of sort of bifurcating their elections based on documentary proof of citizenship, plus some things that Arizona hasn't been able to actually add to their laws. So that's going through their Senate hearing process tomorrow. So just thinking about what's going on this week, when we talk about the map that I showed, there really are 20 little fires that are going on throughout the country, and still bills that have been introduced that, we would certainly expect to see action on. Thinking about states like Florida, where there's some legislation around requiring certain first-time registrants to have to go through a process similar to the SAVE Act. So really, kind of taking each one as they come, but realizing that they're all deeply impactful in terms of the voter experience, and also, the engagement that we have with local organizations, thinking about how they continue their own engagement, whether it's, voter registration, whether it's get out the vote drives, all of those things are, trying to take and understand those impacts as they come.
Thank you. And we have a bunch of audience questions coming in, so I know we want to make room for those. And I had one other question, which is what nonprofits can do, but I think hopefully the answer is obvious. Contact your legislators, contact your members of Congress, mobilize your respective networks to oppose both the federal SAVE Act and whatever state variations there are. And I know the Voting Rights Lab, Travis, if you could put that Voting Rights Lab link in the chat window again for folks. And then I guess I'm going to turn it back over to Gwen, who's got some of the audience questions, which then we can tie it up with some other wrap up.
Thank you so much, Brian. And yes, panel, this is all really great information. That the chat is very active, as is the Q&A. So I want to make sure we have some time to get to these. So you all spoke to this just a little bit, but just to make things clear, several folks asked about where this is in the process. So it has been introduced in Congress. We know that there is a companion bill in the Senate. We're expecting maybe to hear some hearings by the end of the month, perhaps. Anything else that you can say just about the process? And then there was also a question about, like, does the filibuster come into play here? So if you're able to speak to that, we would just, yeah, that's a combination of several of the questions.
I can jump in to speak to that. Where we are in the process is that this can come to the floor of the House or the Senate whenever the leadership of those chambers decides that they want to. House leadership has said consistently over the last few months, this bill is one of their priorities. I believe at the top of this Congress, they identified 12 priority bills, and this was one of them. We expect it to be relatively soon that might happen in terms of the filibuster in the Senate. That's obviously one potential path. I don't want to guess at what might happen. It will depend on how much support it gets, and that's why it's so important right now to take very seriously that call to action. Now is the time, once they've, once they're talking about bringing it to the floor and making any small tweaks they might want to make, that's at a point where likely a lot of minds have been made up. So I know that's a little vague of an answer, but it's where the process is.
Yeah, thank you. Anything to add later, Daniel? Yeah, that's about where we are with it. And so I will be sharing here. We have an action tool on our website where you can send a message to your legislator. But I'll also encourage folks that phone calls are a good way to do that as well, and can be really effective as well there. Great. Our next question is, someone said, I've been telling people that the SAVE Act is fixing a problem that doesn't exist, voter fraud. But is there a place to learn about how and where voter fraud is actually happening? Do we have, examples? Is the SAVE Act really responding to a large and widespread issue, or is it something else?
Speak a little bit to that based on some research we've done. And, Brendan's definitely done work there as well, that it's pretty clear that the empirical data shows that non-citizen voting is extremely rare. Can't say non-existent, but you're talking, very few instances of that actually occurring. So, to the extent that, the SAVE Act is a hatchet to fix a small problem, that's absolutely true. And certainly something that we've tried to voice out with some messaging research that we've done as well, really trying to, one, impress folks with the notion that it is a rare issue that doesn't require a drastic solution, but then also trying where we can to reinforce the existing checks and balances in place in the voter registration and voting process, to let folks know that election officials already have tools that let them identify, the few votes who may try to slip through the process. And, you've also seen in a few places like Michigan that there have been some arrests made, so they're catching them. So, kind of thinking about it from all of those points of view, definitely when we're able to kind of lift that up in terms of some of the comms work and messaging, we're definitely trying to do that.
I would
Great.
also
Yeah.
say, from like the program perspective and like meeting voters on the ground, like State Voices does an enormous amount of training with canvassers, with state affiliates to just make sure that they understand the process to collect a voter registration card. And we, I think we don't want to get into the notion that there are a widespread fraud effort, because as Daniel just pointed out, like, it is very far and in between. And that's not, I mean, we can do all the training to kind of overcome that.
I'll just chime in very quickly. Both those points are absolutely right. I couldn't echo them more, but just to give a couple data points if people are interested in having those on hand. First of all, last year in Ohio, shortly before the election, the Secretary of State implemented some rules that involved naturalized citizens having to show proof of citizenship papers. That was despite the fact that between 2008 and 2020 in Ohio, officials identified 6 potential cases of voting by non-citizens. That's 6 total cases in a state where millions of people vote every year over the course of 12 years. I believe that's going to be 7 federal elections. Similarly, after the Texas Secretary of State made a lot of comments following the 2020 election about his belief that there was fraud in that election, his office spent 22,000 working hours investigating that fraud. Their final report found something like 15 cases where someone wrote the wrong address on their forms. That was their big finding. That was not all about investigating non-citizens voting. It was broader. But again, that's something that if it were happening in any widespread way is certainly something they would have caught.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think that's a really good reminder that sometimes imagine that our elected leaders are introducing things for some political motivations and not always because it's fixing an issue. So we just need to pay attention to that as community members, right? We are electing these folks and we are able to hold them accountable for that. The next question here really speaks to several questions that have come through. And I know I was paying attention to the real ID for a while. And just, I know the deadline has been moved over the past even few years about when we have to have a real ID. But where does that fit into this whole process? You know, is a real ID going to be enough to prove citizenship, or is there going to need to be more? And that can go to any.
I can start off seeing no other takers. But let me first say very clearly up front, I'm not an expert in real ID or other driver's licenses or types of identification. So I don't want to get too into the details here, but to say real ID is not going to solve the issues that the SAVE Act would create. And there's a few reasons for that I think are pretty clear off the bat. One of them, as Gwen just alluded, is that implementation dates for real IDs have been pushed back. This is something that's going to take a long time. I think my driver's license, which is not a real ID, doesn't expire until 2032. It's going to take a long time for people to upgrade their IDs. Lots of elections are going to pass in the meantime. Second of all, is that to get a real ID, my understanding is you need to present, for example, your birth certificate or passport. If you're one of the 21 million Americans who don't have these documents, getting a real ID is not going to solve the issue that you can't present your birth certificate or passport to election officials. So real ID is something that if it were, and it's the same types of people who struggle, it's the same types of people who are going to struggle to get real IDs. I think they're more expensive, at least in some states than other IDs. And so it's still going to leave gaps. It's still going to impose heavy burdens. And it's something that is not, having a real ID is not under federal law a prerequisite. SAVE Act is something that potentially changes, is not a prerequisite to voting. So we shouldn't see that as some sort of save-all.
Yeah, I'll add that with respect to the words or the text of the SAVE Act, one thing that it talks about is a real ID is okay if it proves that the bearer is a U.S. citizen. The issue there is that in most states, except for maybe a few near the Canadian border who have what's called an enhanced driver's license, a real ID is proof of lawful presence, not necessarily citizenship. So when you have that gold star in the corner, that means you're lawfully present, but it's not necessarily proof that the individual who bears it is actually a citizen. So unless there's some way to coordinate what was provided to get the real ID through agency sharing and that sort of thing, it's unlikely that real ID is really going to be effective as, solving a lot of the issues that the SAVE Act would create.
Yeah, thank you. I know that's something a lot of folks have been asking about, so appreciate you taking that one. Just got a couple more questions here. speaking of just IDs, there are lots of specific populations that would be impacted by this. We've already talked about women who are married and may have taken a spouse's last name. Also, folks within the trans community who may have legally transitioned their name or gender marker, but their birth certificate might not match that. And we know that some states you're able to change the gender marker on your birth certificate, and some you are not. Joel, just speak to that, just those certain populations of individuals who might be impacted just because of their name. I mean, people, even for other reasons, have changed their name, and it is different than what they were, assigned at birth. So just could you speak to that a little bit, the populations it would impact and how it might impact them?
I can jump in. I mean, it's an important observation. Absolutely. Trans people could be affected by this bill as well due to the reasons Gwen identified. Certainly Native voters are another community for whom this could present issues. They, depending on where they live, might have a traditional street address. And while the SAVE Act doesn't bar people from registering without a traditional street address, they might be in a place where it's harder to get to an election official to show them some sort of documentary proof of citizenship. They may be less likely to have it overall, especially if they live on tribal lands. And so that's another group I want to mention as well. And again, people change their names or their birth certificate might not match who they are 20, 30, 60 years later. That's something the SAVE Act doesn't properly account for.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for bringing the other populations there. We did have a question about Alaska and really remote or rural communities who don't necessarily have access to birth certificates and all that. And we know that it is costly to go and get it and just takes time and all of that. So the last question I want to wrap this section up with is around just organizations that have traditionally and in the past done voter registration or voter registration drives. What are the things that they should be thinking about this year? We are in a year of a lot of local elections. I'd like to remind folks that every year is an election year. Just because last year was a presidential election doesn't mean that we're not still getting ready for elections this year, and some are already underway and happening. So for the nonprofits that do that voter engagement work, can you talk about just things that they should be paying attention to? If they have been authorized by the Secretary of State to do third-party registration, should they be checking again this year? Kind of what are some of those steps that organizations should be taking so that they can ensure they are in compliance, at least as of now, with all they need to do for voter engagement?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think number one, to stay in compliance, check with your own legal counsel. But number two, I think it's really important to just stay up to date on the rules and regulations as they apply at the state level and as they apply or change perhaps at the federal level. So I know at least where I live in Virginia, all of the canvassers that are certified through the Secretary of State have to do a training every year. And so that is something to continue to do. In terms of the like day-to-day practicalities, I think that, there is the SAVE bill on the horizon, but there is absolutely nothing preventing folks from registering now, from reminding folks if they live in a state with elections this year that it is so important to go out and vote, and that they still have the opportunity to register or re-register without hassle.
Only thing I would add is that, definitely keep an eye on the SAVE Act and how that can be impactful to your work. But there's always so much other legislation going through the states that is really impactful on the way that third parties can and cannot do their work. Thinking about states like Texas and many others where it's always been difficult to sort of engage in third-party voter registration, and states like Florida and a lot of others where it's becoming increasingly difficult to engage in third-party registration. Just kind of understanding, what is happening in the state legislature and how that might impact your work is something that I would invite everyone to pay attention to.
Great. Thank you all so much. Just want to pass on a round of applause and much gratitude to you all, to Andrew and Daniel and Elena, and to Brian for facilitating here. Thank you all so much. This is really enlightening and really helpful. Wanted to just remind you all and give you a save the date here. Our next webinar is coming up on April 23rd, and it is staying nonpartisan. So a lot of these questions that you all have around how to stay nonpartisan, things that you can do as a 501c3, we are bringing in the attorneys to answer some of those questions. So just make sure that you register for that. We'll share the link in the chat and also in our follow-up emails. And then I really cannot leave you all without an action item. I was trained as a community organizer, so we cannot leave without an action item. So we're going to put that in the chat. We have a tool where you can send a message to your legislator specifically, asking them to oppose the SAVE Act. You can do the same. I encourage you to check out the trackers that Voting Rights Lab has, and within your state. Also, if these bills are coming up, please do make your voice heard as an individual or as an organization, because it's really important to our democracy that we keep voting accessible to the folks that are able to vote. So we'll be sharing that link in the chat. Also, if you want to learn more about Nonprofit Vote or get involved in other ways for us, you can take the Nonprofit Vote Pledge here. That will add you to our email list and encourage you to get more information. We'll let you know about future webinars and all of that. So want to just pass on again a thank you to everyone who attended and to our panel and to our moderator, also to Travis, who is supporting backstage here. So thank you all so much for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.